An empire built on power. In the heart of a bustling metropolis, the skyline gleamed with towering giants of glass and steel, each structure embodying the spirit of relentless ambition and success. Among them stood Apex Industries, its sleek, modern facade casting a shadow across the crowded streets below. Inside, the building pulsed with the energy of hundreds of employees, dedicated, driven individuals who had each carved out their place in the world of business. Apex was a name synonymous with power, innovation, and wealth, and at the helm of it all was Richard Kane, the CEO and visionary leader who had built the company from the ground up. Richard was a man in his early 50s with the bearing of a king surveying his kingdom. Sharp features framed by silvering hair and intense, calculating eyes gave him an air of sophistication and command. In his tailored suits and with an unwavering focus, he embodied the values of Apex: ruthless efficiency, a drive for profit, and an obsession with the bottom line. To Richard, success was measured in numbers, not people. The employees he led, whether executives or janitors, were mere cogs in the grand machine he had engineered. Richard's office, perched on the top floor, was a testament to his status and authority. It was a spacious sanctuary of glass and chrome, adorned with minimalist decor that reflected his no-nonsense attitude toward business. From his vantage point, he could gaze out over the city, the endless sprawl a reminder of his ascent to power and his dominance in the corporate world. The company thrived under Richard's leadership, and profit margins soared year after year. However, beneath the shiny exterior of Apex lay an undercurrent of dissatisfaction and disillusionment. Employees spoke in hushed tones about the long hours, the constant pressure, and the cold indifference of their leader. Richard's approach was clear. As long as the profits rolled in, there was no room for compassion, camaraderie, or connection. To him, these were luxuries that had no place in the cutthroat world of business. One morning, as the clock ticked toward noon, Richard was engrossed in the latest financial report, his gaze fixed on the figures that would once again prove his genius to the board and shareholders. A knock on the door interrupted his thoughts, and he glanced up, irritation flickering across his face. "Come in," he barked, his voice echoing off the polished walls. His assistant, Emily, entered, her expression nervous and her steps tentative. "Mr. Kane, the board meeting is about to start," she said quietly, clutching her tablet as if it were a shield. Richard barely looked up. "I'll be there in a moment." He returned his focus to the report, his mind racing with strategies to boost revenue further. Then, as if a secondary thought had surfaced, he looked at Emily with a frown. "And get that janitor out of the lobby. He's a distraction." Emily blinked, taken aback by his tone. "You mean Mr. Jennings?" she asked cautiously. "He's just doing his job." Richard scoffed, waving a dismissive hand. "I don't care. It's unprofessional. We don't need someone like him hanging around and giving the wrong impression. This is a top-tier company, not a charity." Emily felt a pang of discomfort. Mr. Jennings was a familiar figure around Apex, a quiet, older man who greeted everyone with a warm smile and a kind word. He had been a fixture at the company for years, his presence a rare reminder of the humanity that sometimes got lost in the corporate grind. Emily respected him. She knew he worked hard to keep the building immaculate for everyone who walked through its doors. "Mr. Jennings has been here for a long time, sir," she ventured, her voice barely a whisper. "He's part of the company." Richard's eyes narrowed, his patience wearing thin. "Years mean nothing if he's a distraction," he snapped. "He's in the way. Get rid of him. I don't want to see him here by the end of the day." Emily's heart sank. She knew there was no arguing with Richard. His word was law within Apex, and defying him was out of the question. She nodded and turned to leave, feeling the weight of the dismissal settling heavily on her conscience. As she walked through the pristine, bustling hallways, she couldn't shake the sense of injustice simmering inside her. Mr. Jennings deserved better than to be cast aside so thoughtlessly, but she was powerless against the whims of a CEO whose world revolved around power and profits. Reaching the lobby, she found Mr. Jennings on his knees, carefully scrubbing a stubborn stain from the polished floor. His uniform was worn, and his hair was graying, but there was a quiet dignity in his posture and a gentleness in his eyes as he looked up and saw Emily approaching. "Good morning, Miss Emily," he greeted her warmly, his voice deep and steady. "Lovely day, isn't it?" Emily hesitated, struggling to find the words. She had always admired Mr. Jennings for his kindness and dedication. To her, he was more than a janitor. He was a friend, a mentor, and a reminder that integrity and respect could still exist in a place like Apex. "Mr. Jennings," she began, her voice trembling. I'm afraid Mr. Kane wants you to leave." Her voice broke slightly. "He thinks you're a distraction." The old man's face faltered, a flicker of hurt crossing his eyes. For a moment, he simply stared at her, his hands pausing mid-motion on the cleaning cloth. "A distraction," he repeated softly, the words hanging heavy in the air. "I see." Emily's heart ached as she watched the pain in his eyes. "I'm so sorry," she whispered, desperate to convey how much she regretted delivering the message. "I know how hard you work. It's not fair." Mr. Jennings straightened, brushing the dust from his knees as he gathered his cleaning supplies. "Don't blame yourself, Miss Emily," he said gently, his tone kind despite the sorrow etched into his face. "This isn't your doing. I've seen men like Mr. Kane before, men who think respect is something you can buy or command. But life has a way of teaching them otherwise." With a sad smile, he picked up his cart and turned to leave, pausing only to offer Emily a comforting pat on the shoulder. "Thank you for telling me. Take care of yourself, Miss Emily. It's a tough world out there." As he walked out the front doors, Emily felt a lump in her throat. She wanted to fight for him, to shout at Richard that he was wrong. But who was she against the power and authority of a CEO who controlled every aspect of their world? Later that afternoon, as the board meeting concluded, Richard sat back in his chair, satisfied with the discussions and pleased with the reports that reaffirmed his genius. Profits were up, the shareholders were happy, and expansion plans were on track. Yet, his smug moment of triumph was disrupted by Emily's return. "Mr. Jennings has left," she said, her voice steady but filled with sadness. "As you requested." Richard barely acknowledged her, waving a hand dismissively. "Good. We need a more professional image around here. We can't have distractions cluttering up the place." Emily bit her tongue, restraining the anger bubbling up inside her. "He was a dedicated employee, Mr. Kane. He worked hard for this company." Richard scoffed, his tone cold and indifferent. "Dedication doesn't pay the bills, Emily. This is a business, not a shelter." With that, he dismissed her, returning to his reports as if the entire incident had been nothing more than a minor inconvenience. Little did he know, the man he had dismissed was far more than just a janitor. The man behind the broom. As Richard Kane returned to his reports, wholly unaware of the storm he had just set into motion, Mr. Jennings walked through the bustling city streets, his mind awash with memories. To most who saw him, he was just an elderly man, shoulders slightly stooped, moving with a deliberate gait. But behind the gentle demeanor and humble work clothes lay a history that no one at Apex could have guessed, a history filled with resilience, sacrifice, and the kind of courage that could never be measured by job titles or office spaces. For Mr. Jennings, being a janitor was not the culmination of his life, but a quiet chapter he had chosen after a storied career in the Special Forces. It was a role that gave him peace, purpose, and a sense of humility after years in the field. He had seen more hardship, loss, and triumph than most could fathom. And now, after retiring, he found comfort in the simple act of working with his hands, maintaining order in a world that often felt chaotic. He made his way to a small park nestled between skyscrapers, its green lawn and benches a sanctuary from the constant noise of the city. He settled onto one of the benches, leaning back and letting the cool autumn air calm his thoughts. But the quiet couldn't quell the sting of what had happened that morning. Being dismissed so thoughtlessly, after years of service, after forming connections with employees who had become like family, felt like a betrayal of his values, of his belief in the importance of every individual's role, no matter how small. His mind drifted back to his time in the military, a different world where loyalty and respect were not optional but essential. He remembered the day he first enlisted, just barely out of his 20s, idealistic and driven by a desire to serve his country. His father, a decorated war veteran, had taught him that true strength lay not in brute force or arrogance, but in integrity and resilience. His father's words had shaped him, guided him through the darkest days of his service, and remained etched into his heart long after he hung up his uniform. The memories flowed like a river, intense, vivid, and unfiltered. His first deployment had taken him to a conflict zone where chaos reigned and lives hung by a thread. He remembered the sweat and dirt, the fear and the adrenaline as he and his team navigated treacherous terrain, every decision a matter of life or death. They had been a close-knit unit, relying on each other with a trust that only grew stronger in the face of adversity. Each mission had tested him in ways he had never anticipated, pushing him beyond his physical and emotional limits. But it wasn't the dangers of combat that had left the deepest scars. It was the loss of those who had fought alongside him, men and women who had become like family, their laughter and bravery forever etched in his memory. One mission, in particular, haunted him to this day. It had been a routine extraction operation, or so they thought. His team was tasked with rescuing civilians, held hostage by a ruthless militia. But what they didn't know was that the militia had anticipated their arrival. As soon as they entered the compound, bullets began to rain down on them. The firefight was fierce, chaotic, and in the midst of it, his closest friend and brother-in-arms, Sergeant Michael Ortiz, had fallen. Michael had been more than a friend. He was a confidant, a man who could lighten any moment with his infectious laughter. They had shared stories, hopes, and dreams on quiet nights between missions, forging a bond that transcended the battlefield. And in that moment, as he held Michael in his arms, watching the life slip from his eyes, Mr. Jennings had felt a part of himself die as well. The mission ended in victory, but he returned home carrying a burden he could never truly set down. After that day, the thrill of combat lost its appeal, replaced by a weariness that no amount of training could dispel. Eventually, he left the military, hoping to find peace in a civilian life he had once taken for granted. But returning to a world untouched by war was harder than he had expected. The memories lingered, surfacing in the quiet hours and casting shadows over even the simplest moments. For years, he struggled to find his place. He moved from job to job, seeking purpose, trying to fill the void left by the camaraderie and meaning he had found in the military. Eventually, he took on the role of a janitor at Apex Industries. The work was honest and grounded. It allowed him to retreat from the complexities of the world, to find solace in routine and humility. At Apex, he became part of the fabric of the building, a quiet presence who knew every hallway, every office, and who greeted each employee with kindness and respect. He remembered the faces of those he had come to know, the young interns who smiled shyly as they passed him, the executives who rushed by without a second glance, and the ones who, like Emily, stopped to chat, appreciating his gentle wisdom and listening ear. For Mr. Jennings, these interactions were meaningful. They reminded him that everyone, no matter their role, was a vital part of something larger. But Richard Kane had never acknowledged him. To the CEO, he was invisible, an unimportant detail in a world governed by profit and image. Today's dismissal had been the ultimate confirmation of that indifference, a reminder that in Richard's eyes, he was nothing more than an inconvenience. As he sat on the park bench, lost in thought, Mr. Jennings felt the familiar pang of frustration, not just at the dismissal, but at the culture that fostered such indifference. Richard Kane's arrogance was emblematic of a larger issue, a corporate world where respect and integrity often took a back seat to ambition and greed. And yet, as much as it hurt, He knew this was not the end of his story. He had faced far greater challenges than a dismissal, and he would not let this moment define him. Rising from the bench, he looked around at the city skyline, a symbol of resilience and transformation. A renewed determination surged within him. He might have been dismissed, but he wasn't defeated. He would find a way to return to Apex, to show Richard and everyone else that respect was not something reserved for the powerful. It was a fundamental right of every person, no matter their position. He would make them see that strength was not just a product of status or authority, but of character and compassion. Over the next few days, Mr. Jennings prepared himself, reflecting on how best to approach the situation. He knew that simply demanding respect wouldn't work. Richard and the executives at Apex lived in a world of logic, numbers, and results. To reach them, he would have to speak their language, to prove that respect, kindness, and a culture of unity could benefit the company's bottom line. He began reaching out to former colleagues, leaders in the veteran community who had successfully transitioned to civilian roles, seeking advice on how to approach the corporate environment. They encouraged him to share his story, to leverage his experiences not just as a plea for dignity, but as an example of resilience and leadership. Together, they brainstormed ways to make an impact, offering strategies for addressing corporate leaders and crafting a message that would resonate with people who had never set foot on a battlefield. By the end of the week, Mr. Jennings had a plan. He would return to Apex, not as a defeated employee but as a man with a mission to change the culture of a company that had lost its way. He would reach out to the employees who had come to respect him, like Emily, gathering their support and building a coalition of voices that would be hard to ignore. He would find a way to speak to the board, to share his story not as a janitor but as a former soldier, a leader who understood that true power lay in lifting others up, not in tearing them down. With each passing day, his determination grew. He spent hours preparing, crafting his words and practicing his speech, imagining the faces of those who would hear his message. He envisioned a world where people were valued not for their titles but for their contributions, where respect was woven into the fabric of a company's identity. On the night before his planned return, Mr. Jennings sat alone in his small apartment, reviewing his notes and rehearsing his message. His voice grew stronger with each repetition, his resolve hardening as he spoke into the quiet of the room. "Respect is earned, not demanded," he declared, his voice filled with conviction. "True strength lies in character, not in title. And in a world that often forgets this, we have the power to remind them." As the first light of dawn broke over the city, Mr. Jennings felt ready. The path ahead was uncertain, and he knew he was venturing into uncharted territory. But he was no stranger to challenges, and he understood that the most important battles were often fought not on distant fields, but in the spaces we inhabited every day. With a deep breath and a heart full of purpose, he rose to face the day, determined to make his voice heard, to reclaim his dignity, and to remind those around him that respect was not a privilege, but a right. Standing tall in the den of power, as the sun climbed over the towering skyline of the city, casting golden light over glass and steel, Mr. Jennings approached the Apex Industries building with a determined stride. In his heart, he held not only his plan but the conviction that he could inspire change, not just for himself, but for everyone who worked within those walls. The building loomed large before him, its reflective windows glistening as if challenging him to enter. But today, he would not be intimidated. He would walk in with purpose, as a man who had faced far greater battles and endured unimaginable loss. Inside, the lobby bustled with employees heading to their desks, faces focused, expressions guarded. They moved with an air of quiet detachment, eyes fixed on the tasks that awaited them in their offices. The environment was one of silent compliance, each person isolated in their own world, driven by deadlines, and the unspoken rule that emotions and personal struggles had no place here. This was a workplace that prioritized efficiency, but at the cost of connection and compassion. Mr. Jennings felt a renewed sense of purpose rise within him. He would challenge this status quo, not through confrontation, but by sharing a story that could not be ignored. As he walked toward the elevators, he spotted Emily in the distance, her gaze downcast as she clutched a stack of files. She looked up, surprised to see him, and for a moment, her eyes widened with relief. "Mr. Jennings, you're back," she whispered, glancing around nervously. He nodded, giving her a reassuring smile. "I am, Emily, but not as the janitor they dismissed. Today, I'm here to speak, to make them see that respect isn't a gift to be handed down by those in power. It's a right." Emily's face softened, her eyes shimmering with a mixture of hope and gratitude. She knew Mr. Jennings as more than just a janitor. He was a source of quiet wisdom, someone who had always treated everyone with dignity, regardless of their position. She leaned closer, her voice steady but full of conviction. "You're doing the right thing," she murmured. "People need to hear this, Mr. Jennings. I'll support you in any way I can." Encouraged, he stepped into the elevator and pressed the button for the top floor, his heart pounding with anticipation. His journey to the executive suite felt both familiar and foreign. He had been to every corner of this building countless times, yet today, with his purpose burning bright within him, it felt different. This was no ordinary day, and he knew it. When the elevator doors opened onto the executive floor, Mr. Jennings found himself facing the glass-walled conference room, where Richard Kane and the board members were already gathered. Through the transparent walls, he could see Richard seated at the head of the table, his expression commanding and confident as he addressed the room. The executives around him leaned forward, listening intently, nodding as they took notes. Their world was one of financial projections, quarterly goals, and market strategies, a place where human stories often got lost in the race for numbers. Taking a deep breath, Mr. Jennings walked up to the door, his hand hovering over the handle for a moment before he pushed it open. The room fell silent as the executives turned, surprise and confusion flashing across their faces. Richard's brows knitted in irritation. "What is this?" he demanded, his voice low and sharp. "This is a closed meeting." "I understand, Mr. Kane," Mr. Jennings replied, his voice calm but firm. "But I believe I have something important to say, something that concerns everyone in this room." Richard leaned back, his expression one of barely concealed annoyance. "Mr. Jennings, we already discussed this. You were let go. There's nothing more to discuss." But Mr. Jennings held his ground, his gaze unwavering. "I didn't come here to ask for my job back," he said, his voice carrying a quiet strength. "I came here to share a story about respect, dignity, and the kind of leadership that goes beyond profits." The executives glanced at one another, their curiosity piqued despite the palpable tension. Richard, clearly irked but unwilling to make a scene in front of his colleagues, waved a dismissive hand. "Fine," he said, his tone dripping with impatience. "But make it quick." Mr. Jennings took a moment to steady himself, his eyes scanning the faces in the room. These were powerful men and women, people who wielded influence over hundreds of lives. Yet today they would hear from someone they had never considered worth their time. "I served in the Special Forces for over 2 decades, he began, his voice calm but powerful. "During those years, I faced challenges that tested every part of who I am. I saw people give everything for a cause, not because of money or titles, but because they trusted and respected the person standing beside them. They knew that in the darkest moments, we relied on each other, not as commanders and subordinates, but as people who shared a bond, a mutual respect that went beyond rank." The room was silent, the executive's eyes fixed on him, listening intently. Mr. Jennings continued, his voice taking on a deeper tone as he delved into the story of his most harrowing mission, the one that had changed his life forever. "We were on a rescue mission," he said, his gaze drifting to a memory that was both vivid and painful. "The objective was simple: extract hostages from a hostile area. But things went wrong. We were ambushed, caught off guard in the darkness, surrounded on all sides. Bullets flew, and in the chaos, I lost my closest friend. A man who was more like a brother to me, someone who had stood by me through every storm. He paused, the memory filling the silence. He could see the executives' expressions shift, their initial skepticism giving way to something else. Understanding, maybe even empathy. I held him in my arms as he died, he said, his voice a whisper. And in that moment, I learned that respect and loyalty aren't just words. They're values that define who we are, and they matter more than any title or paycheck. In the years that followed, I left the military and eventually found my way here, to Apex, where I thought I could find peace in quiet work, in contributing to a company that, I believed, valued everyone who walked through its doors. He looked directly at Richard, his eyes piercing. But yesterday I was dismissed without a second thought, told I was a distraction, and I realized that this place has lost sight of what matters. Respect isn't something that's earned only by the powerful. It's a right, a dignity we all deserve. The room remained silent, each executive lost in thought. Even Richard seemed momentarily taken aback, his usual mask of authority slipping as he shifted in his seat, perhaps sensing the weight of Mr. Jennings' words. "I don't want anything from you," Mr. Jennings continued, his voice resolute. "But I want to leave you with a challenge. Look at the people who keep this place running, not just the executives, but the assistants, the technicians, the janitors. Understand that every single one of them plays a part in the success of this company. And if you want Apex to truly thrive, you have to lead with more than profit. You have to lead with respect." He straightened, his posture dignified, a quiet strength emanating from him that no suit or title could bestow. Leadership isn't just about making decisions from the top. It's about lifting those around you, understanding that the strength of this company lies in the unity of everyone who works here. That's the legacy you could build, a place where respect and humanity matter. The silence lingered as Mr. Jennings stepped back, his gaze sweeping over the room one last time. He could see the shift in their expressions, the way his words had struck a chord. Even Richard, though visibly displeased, seemed to be processing the impact of what he had just heard. Just as Mr. Jennings turned to leave, Emily entered the room, her face flushed with a mixture of determination and pride. She looked directly at Richard, her voice steady. "Mr. Jennings is right," she said. "We've all been so focused on results that we've forgotten the people who make them possible. This company isn't just a machine. It's a community, and every person here deserves respect." Several of the executives nodded, their eyes reflecting newfound awareness. One of them, an older man named James, cleared his throat. "I think Mr. Jennings has made a valuable point," he said, glancing at his colleagues. "We could all benefit from reflecting on our approach to leadership, to consider how we treat everyone in this company." Richard's jaw tightened, his frustration evident, but he remained silent, absorbing the unexpected turn of events. Seeing the momentum building, Mr. Jennings seized the moment. "I may no longer work here," he said, his voice warm but resolute, "but my hope is that my story stays with you. Apex has the potential to be a company where people don't just work but thrive, where respect isn't a luxury, but a core value." With that, he gave a final nod and exited the conference room, leaving a room full of executives who, for the first time, were questioning the culture they had so meticulously crafted. As he walked out of the building, Emily caught up with him, her face alight with admiration. "You did it, Mr. Jennings," she whispered. "I think they finally heard you." He smiled, a glimmer of satisfaction in his eyes. "Perhaps, Emily. But the true test will be in what they do next." And as he stepped out into the morning light, he felt a profound sense of peace. He had done what he came to do, planting a seed that, with time and care, could grow into something transformative. In that moment, he knew that his journey was far from over. But today, he had taken the first step in reclaiming his dignity and in showing others the power of respect and integrity. Ripples of change. Days passed after Mr. Jennings' unexpected confrontation with the Apex executives, yet the impact of his words lingered, echoing through the hallways, whispered in break rooms, and discussed quietly between desks. His message, simple, powerful, and undeniable, had set in motion a shift in perspective, a ripple effect that even the most stoic employees couldn't ignore. As Richard Kane sat in his corner office one crisp autumn morning, he found himself staring out over the city, the usual satisfaction he drew from his kingdom strangely muted. Mr. Jennings' speech had stirred something uncomfortable in him. The janitor he had so easily dismissed was more than the quiet figure who cleaned the floors. He was a man with strength, resilience, and wisdom. And now, his absence was felt everywhere. Richard's assistant, Emily, knocked softly on his door, and he waved her in without looking up. "Sir, I have the notes for the town hall meeting you scheduled for tomorrow," she said, placing a neatly prepared binder on his desk. "There's been quite a bit of interest. I think people are eager to hear from you." Richard looked up, his gaze unreadable. He knew that this meeting would be different. This wasn't a typical corporate gathering about quarterly goals or productivity metrics. This was an opportunity, perhaps even a reckoning. And if he ignored it, he risked more than just low employee morale. He risked alienating the very people who fueled his company's success. "Yes, thank you, Emily," he replied, his voice measured. And Emily. Was that janitor really as important as people are making him out to be? Emily hesitated, sensing the opening she'd been waiting for. Mr. Kane, Mr. Jennings was more than a janitor to a lot of people here. He treated everyone with respect, no matter who they were. He made us feel seen. She stopped, searching his face for any sign that he understood. I think his words reached people because they came from someone who genuinely cared about everyone in this company, even if he was overlooked himself. Richard nodded, his expression thoughtful, but he remained silent. As Emily left the room, Richard knew that if he was going to save his company's culture, he would have to confront something he had long avoided: his own attitude toward those he deemed beneath him. The following day, the main lobby was transformed. Rows of chairs had been arranged in front of a makeshift stage, creating an open space where employees from every level, executives, managers, assistants, and even maintenance staff, could gather. It was a rare sight, an intentional breaking of hierarchy, and the atmosphere buzzed with anticipation. As the crowd settled, Richard took the stage, glancing out over the faces turned toward him. Some looked skeptical, others curious, and a few bore expressions of quiet defiance. For the first time in a long while, Richard felt a pang of uncertainty, but he pushed it aside, drawing on his years of practiced authority. "Thank you all for coming today," he began, his voice carrying easily across the room. "As you all know, there have been discussions about our culture here at Apex. We're known for our success, our innovation, and our drive. But recently, we were reminded that a company is more than numbers, it's people." A murmur ran through the crowd, and Richard paused, letting his words sink in. "We've all heard about the recent departure of Mr. Jennings, our janitor. Many of you knew him well, and I'm beginning to realize that I didn't know him at all. When he spoke to us last week, he shared something I hadn't considered in a long time: respect for every individual, regardless of their position." The room was silent now, and Richard continued, his tone more measured. "Mr. Jennings reminded us that everyone in this building plays a role in our success." His words struck a chord, and I want to take this opportunity to listen, to understand what you all need to feel valued here at Apex. I want to open the floor to your ideas and concerns. For a moment, no one moved, but then, a young woman from the marketing department stood, her hand raised. Richard recognized her as Lisa, one of the quieter employees who often worked late hours. "I've been here for 4 years, and I've always worked hard to meet expectations," she began, her voice steady but filled with emotion. "But sometimes, it feels like no one sees the effort. Mr. Jennings, he always noticed. He knew our names, asked about our families. He made us feel like we mattered." Others began to nod. murmuring agreement, and soon more voices joined in. An older technician, a soft-spoken intern, a mid-level manager, they all shared their stories, painting a picture of an environment where people felt disconnected, unseen, and underappreciated. As the stories poured out, Richard listened, each account piercing the wall he had so carefully built around himself. These were his employees, people he had relied on to keep his company thriving. Yet he had never once thought about what it took for them to work tirelessly, day after day, without acknowledgement. At the end of the meeting, Richard took a deep breath, his voice steady but tinged with humility. "Thank you for your honesty. I see now that there are changes we need to make, not only to improve morale, but to create a culture that values everyone here. I can't promise instant results, but I commit to listening and working with each of you to make Apex a place where respect is at the core of our success." When he stepped off the stage, a wave of applause followed him, a tentative show of approval from a workforce that had long felt overlooked. Richard knew this was only the beginning, but it was a start, a chance to mend the fractures that had grown beneath Apex's polished exterior. The blueprint for change. Over the following weeks, Richard worked closely with a new advisory team, handpicked from various departments, including Emily and James, the veteran executive who had shown support for Mr. Jennings' message. Together, they crafted a plan that focused on respect, empowerment, and transparency. They called it the Blueprint for Change. The blueprint included new initiatives aimed at fostering an open-door policy, regular check-ins with all levels of employees, and town hall meetings to ensure that everyone's voice could be heard. Additionally, they introduced a recognition program where employees could nominate each other for contributions that often went unnoticed, small gestures of kindness, teamwork, and going the extra mile. But perhaps the most transformative initiative was a mentorship program, inspired by Mr. Jennings' words about the importance of human connection. Each department leader would pair up with employees across various roles, building relationships that broke down the barriers of hierarchy and encouraged mutual respect. Emily, who had been one of the program's strongest advocates, volunteered to lead the first workshop, gathering employees for team-building exercises that emphasized collaboration and empathy. She watched with pride as people from different departments, who had barely spoken to one another, began to laugh, share stories, and discover the hidden strengths each person brought to the company. At the end of the first workshop, a tall man with a reserved demeanor approached Emily. He introduced himself as Omar, a logistics manager who had spent most of his time buried in paperwork and deadlines. "I just wanted to say, thank you," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I never realized how much we all had in common. This workshop reminded me that we're all here for the same reason, trying to do good work. It feels different now. Better." Emily smiled, touched by his sincerity. She knew that this was the beginning of a new chapter for Apex, one where people mattered as much as the profits they generated. An unexpected reunion. As the company culture began to shift, stories of Mr. Jennings' impact circulated through the building, his legacy growing stronger with each passing day. Richard found himself reflecting on the janitor he had dismissed without a second thought, wondering if he would ever have the chance to truly thank him for the lesson he had taught them all. Then, one morning, Richard received a letter in his inbox, addressed from a small nonprofit organization in the city. The letter was from Mr. Jennings, who, after his departure, had found a new purpose helping veterans reintegrate into civilian life, a cause close to his heart. In his letter, Mr. Jennings expressed gratitude for his years at Apex, sharing that he had found a renewed sense of purpose. He congratulated Richard on the changes he had implemented, and though he was not returning to the company, he offered to help Apex foster a culture of respect by speaking to their employees about resilience, unity, and the value of every individual's contribution. Richard felt a profound sense of humility as he read the letter. He realized that Mr. Jennings had moved on, not out of bitterness or regret, but out of a desire to continue helping others, a purpose far greater than any corporate ambition. With a quiet resolve, Richard invited Mr. Jennings to speak at Apex's annual gathering, a decision that was met with overwhelming support from the employees. When the day arrived, the entire company gathered in the main lobby, filling the space with anticipation and admiration. Mr. Jennings took the stage, his calm presence a reminder of the strength and wisdom he had imparted to them. He spoke not as a former janitor, but as a leader, sharing stories of his service, his struggles, and the lessons he had learned along the way. "When I look at all of you," he said, his voice steady, "I see more than employees. I see people with dreams, challenges, and unique strengths. Remember that every role has value. And when you respect each other, when you treat each other with dignity, you create something greater than any profit. You build a legacy." As he concluded, the room erupted in applause, the sound filled with respect, gratitude, and a renewed sense of unity. Richard, standing at the back, felt the weight of his own transformation, a journey sparked by a single man's unwavering commitment to respect and integrity. In that moment, Richard knew that Apex had changed, not just in policy, but in spirit. They had become a company where respect was not only valued but celebrated, a place where everyone, from the CEO to the janitor, could find purpose and dignity in their work. And as the applause filled the room, Richard felt a deep sense of fulfillment, knowing that together they had built a legacy that would last. Trials and triumphs. As Apex Industries settled into its new culture of respect and empowerment, the changes inspired by Mr. Jennings' story began to take root, gradually transforming the company's very foundation. But as with any significant shift, there were growing pains and hurdles that tested the resolve of those trying to build something new. Richard Kane had thought that introducing these changes would be the hardest part. He had underestimated, however, the entrenched attitudes of some executives and managers who had thrived under the previous regime. For years, these individuals had operated in an environment that prized results above relationships, a place where performance was measured in profit and where loyalty was often tied to fear. Now, they found themselves in a workplace where empathy and respect were emphasized, and some resented the change, viewing it as a distraction from their primary goal, maintaining Apex's profitability. One of the most vocal among them was Susan Green, a senior executive who had risen through the ranks with an uncompromising approach. She was known for her exacting standards and her insistence that employees meet those standards without complaint. To her, the blueprint for change was an indulgent detour, a distraction that would ultimately weaken Apex's competitive edge. In a tense meeting one winter afternoon, Susan openly voiced her skepticism as Richard outlined the progress and feedback from employees about the new initiatives. The room was filled with the usual faces, department heads, team leaders, and the advisory members who had helped shape the new culture at Apex. "I understand that people want to feel valued, Richard," Susan said, her tone polite but cold. "But if we keep focusing on these feel-good initiatives, we'll lose our edge. Our primary objective should be profit, not building a community." Richard met her gaze, choosing his words carefully. "Susan, I understand your concerns, but I disagree. We've seen a boost in productivity and employee morale because people feel valued and respected. Happy employees work harder, stay longer, and are more innovative. In the long run, this approach will strengthen our bottom line." Susan's eyes narrowed slightly. "So you're saying that profits will just follow if we respect everyone enough? That's an idealistic view, Richard, and it's not what built Apex." The room fell silent, tension thickening the air. Richard took a deep breath, preparing to respond, but it was Emily who broke the silence, her voice calm yet firm. "With respect, Susan, we're not just talking about profits. We're talking about creating a company people want to work for, a place where everyone's contributions matter." Mr. Jennings reminded us that our success is built on more than numbers. It's built on people. A murmur of agreement swept through the room, and Richard seized the moment. "Thank you, Emily," he said, nodding. "Apex has always been about innovation, but we can't innovate if we ignore the human side of our business. If we foster a culture of respect, we'll attract top talent and retain it." Though she remained silent, the look on Susan's face made it clear that she wasn't convinced. She had always valued results over relationships, and this new direction felt to her like a compromise, a dilution of the standards that had propelled her career. As the meeting concluded, Richard knew that he would need to address this resistance, and that Apex's journey was far from over. A mentor in Mr. Jennings. Meanwhile, outside the company, Mr. Jennings had continued his work at the nonprofit, dedicating his days to helping veterans transition to civilian life. His work filled him with a deep sense of purpose, but he remained invested in the changes unfolding at Apex. When Richard reached out to him, explaining the resistance he was facing, Mr. Jennings agreed to come back in an informal capacity, as a mentor and guide for those who struggled to embrace the new culture. On a cold January morning, Mr. Jennings returned to Apex, welcomed with warm greetings from employees who remembered him fondly. His presence was a reminder of the journey they were on, and as he made his way through the halls, he exchanged smiles and handshakes, each interaction a testament to the impact he had left on the company. One of his first meetings was with Susan, whose resistance had only grown since the initial changes. Susan greeted Mr. Jennings politely, but her posture was tense, her expression guarded. "I appreciate your willingness to meet with me, Susan," Mr. Jennings began, his tone as steady and unassuming as ever. "I've heard you have concerns about the new direction Apex is taking." Susan nodded, her face impassive. "I respect what you've done for this company, Mr. Jennings, but I worry that we're losing sight of our goals. We're here to drive results, not coddle people." Mr. Jennings smiled, his gaze warm but unwavering. "I understand, Susan, but I want to share something with you. In the military, we achieved results, but not through fear or by disregarding each other's needs. We succeeded because we trusted and respected one another, because we knew that every member of the team had our back." Susan shifted in her seat, clearly skeptical. "But this isn't the military, Mr. Jennings. This is a corporation. People need structure, discipline, and expectations." Mr. Jennings nodded, acknowledging her point. "You're absolutely right, Susan, but discipline and structure don't mean we can't treat each other with respect. In fact, the strongest teams are built on that foundation. If employees feel valued, they're more likely to go the extra mile, to give their best. That's not coddling, it's empowering." He paused, watching her reaction. "Susan, I can see that you care deeply about this company. You're dedicated and hardworking. But imagine how much more you could achieve if your team knew you valued them, not just for what they produce, but for who they are." Susan's gaze softened, just a fraction. She was silent for a moment, clearly reflecting on his words. Finally, she spoke, her voice quieter. "I see your point, Mr. Jennings. Maybe I haven't given this new approach a fair chance." He smiled, sensing a small victory. "Change isn't easy, Susan. I understand that better than most. But if we work together, I believe we can build a company where both respect and results can thrive." An unexpected ally and a shift in leadership. With Mr. Jennings' guidance, Susan began to gradually embrace the new culture at Apex. She started meeting regularly with her team members, listening to their concerns and encouraging open communication. Over time, she noticed subtle but undeniable changes. Her team was more collaborative, more engaged, and their productivity increased. What she had once dismissed as coddling had become a source of strength, a foundation that supported their drive for excellence. The shift in Susan's approach sent ripples through the company. Other managers who had been wary of the changes saw the impact of her transformation and began to follow suit. Apex's culture of respect was beginning to solidify, and the results were undeniable. Employee satisfaction scores rose, turnover rates dropped, and productivity reached new heights. Meanwhile, Richard and Mr. Jennings continued to work closely together, strategizing ways to sustain this positive momentum. They hosted monthly town halls, inviting employees to share their ideas, concerns, and feedback. They implemented new training programs that emphasized leadership as service, teaching managers how to lead with empathy and understanding. And they introduced a quarterly recognition event where employees at every level were celebrated for their contributions, regardless of their role. In one such event, Richard took the stage to recognize an unexpected star, Omar, the logistics manager who had initially been reluctant to engage with his team. Omar had shown remarkable growth, leading his team with compassion and encouragement. His department's performance had improved significantly, and Richard knew this was a testament to the power of Apex's new culture. As we've learned over the past few months, Richard said, addressing the gathered employees, leadership is not just about meeting numbers, it's about lifting each other up, supporting one another. Omar has shown us what it means to lead with respect, and I'm proud to honor him today. The applause that filled the room was thunderous, and as Richard handed Omar a plaque, he felt a deep sense of pride. This was not the Apex he had envisioned years ago, but it was one he was prouder of, a company that valued its people, a place where every individual could find purpose and dignity. A legacy in the making. As the months turned into seasons, Apex Industries became a company transformed, a place where respect and collaboration were not just ideals but daily practices. New hires often heard stories of Mr. Jennings, the janitor who had changed the company forever. His legacy was woven into the fabric of Apex, a testament to the power of one person's voice and the ripple effect of empathy and integrity. Richard found himself reflecting on Mr. Jennings' impact one warm spring afternoon, standing by the window of his corner office. He thought back to the man he had been, the CEO who had dismissed a janitor without a second thought, driven by ambition and a narrow definition of success. Today, he was a different leader, humbled and inspired by the lessons he had learned from someone who had once been invisible to him. A soft knock at the door interrupted his thoughts, and he turned to see Mr. Jennings standing there, smiling. "Mr. Jennings," Richard said, surprised but pleased. "I didn't expect to see you here today. I just wanted to check in." Mr. Jennings replied, stepping into the office. "I've been hearing good things about the changes here at Apex. Thought I'd come see for myself." Richard chuckled, gesturing to the window. "It's all thanks to you. You opened my eyes to something I'd forgotten, a reminder that we're only as strong as our people. I owe you a great deal." Mr. Jennings shook his head, his expression humble. "You owe yourself, Richard. You listened. And that's more than many people in your position would do." They stood in comfortable silence for a moment, gazing out over the city, the skyline a symbol of resilience and transformation. As they watched, Richard felt a sense of gratitude he could hardly put into words. He realized that Apex's new culture wasn't just a result of policies or programs. It was a testament to the human connections they had forged, the respect and compassion that now defined their company. "Mr. Jennings," Richard said, turning to him, "would you consider coming back, perhaps as an advisor? We could use someone like you to keep us grounded." Mr. Jennings smiled, his eyes warm. "I'd be honored, Richard. After all, there's always room for improvement, isn't there?" They shared a laugh, and as they shook hands, Richard knew that this was just the beginning. Apex Industries was no longer just a powerhouse of profit and success. It was a community, a family bound by respect, compassion, and a commitment to lifting each other up. And in that moment, he knew that they had built something far more valuable than a profitable business. They had built a legacy, a place where people mattered, a place where respect was not just a word but a way of life. And he knew, with a certainty he had never felt before, that Apex would continue to grow, not just in wealth, but in purpose, creating a brighter, stronger future for all who walked through its doors. The legacy of purpose. As the new culture took root within Apex Industries, the company began to garner attention far beyond the confines of its sleek, glass-walled building. News of Apex's transformation spread, capturing the interest of other corporations, business leaders, and media outlets, It was unusual, unheard of, even, for a company so fiercely driven by profit to make such a profound shift toward a people-centric culture, all sparked by a former janitor whose quiet courage had set a powerful example. The atmosphere within Apex was no longer marked by the stifling pressure that had once weighed down every employee. Instead, it pulsed with a vibrant energy fueled by collaboration and mutual respect. Employees from all levels felt empowered, their contributions valued. But with growth came new challenges and opportunities that would test the resilience of this newfound culture and determine whether Apex could truly sustain the legacy of respect it had worked so hard to build. Expanding the vision. Several months after the cultural transformation had begun, Richard Kane received an unexpected invitation. He had been asked to speak at a major leadership conference where CEOs, business leaders, and influencers from around the world would gather to discuss the future of corporate culture. Richard knew that Apex's journey was unique, but he still felt a pang of uncertainty as he prepared for the speech. The man who had once dismissed Mr. Jennings without a second thought was now being called upon to advocate for values he had only recently come to embrace. As he stood on the stage under the bright lights, Richard looked out at the audience, a crowd of sharp, ambitious leaders, some of whom reminded him of himself just a year ago. He cleared his throat, gathering his thoughts, and began. "Good afternoon," he said, his voice steady but reflective. "I am Richard Kane, CEO of Apex Industries. If you'd asked me a year ago to speak on corporate culture, I would have told you that success is built on discipline, ambition, and an unwavering focus on the bottom line. And while those things are important, I now understand that there's something far more vital: people." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle over the room. Our journey at Apex began with a lesson, a reminder from someone who had been overlooked and underestimated for years. A janitor named Mr. Jennings stood in front of our board and challenged us to rethink everything we thought we knew about leadership and respect. He showed us that respect isn't earned through titles or power, but through integrity and kindness. As Richard continued, he shared the transformation that had unfolded at Apex, the new initiatives, the mentorship programs, the open-door policies, and the recognition programs that now celebrated contributions across all levels. He spoke of the challenges, the resistance, and the gradual, undeniable shift that had redefined what success meant for the company. When we began this journey, he concluded, we weren't just trying to improve morale or reduce turnover. We were striving to build a legacy, a company where people felt seen, heard, and valued. And I can tell you this, it's working. Our profits have risen, our productivity has soared, and Apex is a better, stronger company because we learned to lead with respect. The audience was silent, many nodding thoughtfully, others exchanging glances as they processed his words. Richard's speech was met with resounding applause, and in the days that followed, he received numerous messages from leaders inspired by Apex's transformation, eager to implement similar changes in their own organizations. But for Richard, the true reward was seeing the impact within his own walls, the way his employees held their heads higher, worked with pride, and supported each other not just as colleagues but as human beings. Navigating new challenges. With Apex's new reputation came expansion opportunities. Major clients, impressed by the company's values-driven approach, sought partnerships, and the board saw a path to opening new offices across the country. But rapid growth brought its own set of challenges, and Richard knew that maintaining their culture during such a period would require vigilance and commitment. He reached out to Mr. Jennings, who now served as an advisor to the company, helping Richard and his team stay grounded in their purpose. Together, they organized training sessions for the leaders of each new office, sharing Apex's journey and instilling in them the values that had brought about the company's transformation. They spoke candidly about the importance of respect, the power of empathy, and the strength that comes from valuing every individual. One of the sessions, held at the new Chicago office, was attended by Susan Green, Although initially skeptical of the cultural shift, Susan had undergone a profound transformation herself, and she now championed the new approach. She shared her journey with the new employees, explaining how she had once seen respect as a distraction but had come to realize its true importance. "I used to think that results came from pushing people hard," she admitted, her tone reflective. "But what I've learned is that true success comes from lifting people up, from giving them a sense of purpose and pride in their work. I may not have seen it at first, but I can tell you now that this culture has made me a better leader and Apex a better company." Her words resonated with the new team members, and as they asked questions and shared their own experiences, it became clear that Apex's culture was becoming more than just an initiative. It was becoming a movement, one that would continue to shape the company's future. The true power of recognition. As the end of the year approached, Richard and Mr. Jennings decided to introduce an annual Legacy of Respect award given to the employee who had exemplified the company's values of integrity, kindness, and resilience. The award would serve as a reminder of the journey they had undertaken and would honor Mr. Jennings' influence on the company. At the inaugural ceremony, the award was presented to none other than Emily, who had been instrumental in advocating for the changes and supporting her colleagues through the transition. She took the stage with visible emotion, her voice filled with gratitude. "I want to thank Mr. Jennings," she said, her eyes bright with pride. "He showed us that every role matters, that every person deserves respect. I'm proud to work at a company that values people above all else, and I'm honored to be part of this legacy." As she spoke, Mr. Jennings felt a swell of pride. He hadn't sought recognition or praise. He had only hoped to remind others of the values he had lived by. But seeing Emily accept the award, hearing the applause that filled the room, he knew that his message had taken root, that his legacy would endure. The ripple effect. The transformation at Apex began to inspire change beyond the company. Local news outlets covered Apex's journey, and Richard found himself invited to speak at universities, sharing his experience with young entrepreneurs and business students. His message resonated with a new generation of leaders who were eager to build companies that prioritized people, purpose, and profit in equal measure. One day, Richard received a call from a young woman named Maria, who worked at the nonprofit Mr. Jennings had joined after leaving Apex. Maria explained that she had followed Apex's story closely and wanted to replicate its culture within her organization. She asked if Mr. Jennings and Richard would be willing to help her implement similar values-driven initiatives, and they agreed wholeheartedly. Together, they developed a mentorship program, one that focused not only on professional skills, but also on personal growth, resilience, and emotional intelligence. As Maria implemented these changes within the nonprofit, she saw firsthand the transformative power of respect and recognition, and the lives of her employees began to change in ways she hadn't anticipated. Through Maria's organization, Apex's influence continued to ripple outward, touching lives across different industries, inspiring leaders to approach business with compassion, empathy, and respect. A quiet reflection. On a chilly winter evening, Mr. Jennings found himself back in the park where he had once sat, disheartened and uncertain, after being dismissed from Apex. The park, now dusted with a light layer of snow, was a tranquil reminder of how far he had come, how far they had all come. He settled onto a bench, watching as the last light faded from the sky, feeling a deep sense of peace and purpose. He thought of Michael, his fallen friend from his military days, whose memory had been his constant guide, his source of strength. In a way, it felt like he had honored Michael's memory through his work at Apex, carrying forward the values they had shared: honor, integrity, and respect. Just then, he heard footsteps approaching and looked up to see Richard, his breath forming small clouds in the cold air, standing nearby. "Mind if I join you?" Richard asked, his tone respectful. Mr. Jennings smiled, gesturing to the empty space beside him. They sat in companionable silence for a moment, the quiet of the park settling around them. "You've changed a lot, Richard," Mr. Jennings finally said, his voice warm. Richard chuckled, nodding. I have you to thank for that, Mr. Jennings. I used to think that power came from control, from setting hard lines and pushing for results. But you've shown me that true power comes from lifting others up. I'll never forget that. They sat together as night fully enveloped the park, the world quiet and still around them. And in that moment, they both understood that they had built something far greater than a company. They had built a legacy of respect, a testament to the power of kindness, resilience, and purpose. As they rose to leave, Richard extended his hand, and Mr. Jennings shook it firmly, a silent promise passing between them. The promise that this legacy would continue, that Apex would remain a place where people could find dignity and purpose, where respect was woven into every decision, every interaction. And as they walked away, two unlikely allies forged in the fires of humility and growth, they knew that together, they had created something rare and beautiful, a place where people mattered, a place where respect would live on, shaping the lives of all who called Apex their home.